Hello, and welcome to our third installment of going deeper into the book of Revelation. Today we are going to, did I say third installment? This is our fourth installment because we're looking at the fourth church of Revelation. We're looking at the church of Thyatira. To give us some background information on this church, we know that this was the smallest of the seven cities, of the seven churches in Revelation. And it was known for producing a bright red dye. Now, this is a little different than what we consider red, or what we would consider purple, even though they called it purple back in John's day. We would consider it to be scarlet. I don't know when in history that name was changed, but somewhere along the lines it was. This was the home of Lydia, if you remember her from Acts chapter 16, verse 14. She was the dyer of purple. And in Thyatira, in this purple dye trade guilds were very important. But these guilds required participation in pagan festivities. And this was obviously problematic for Christians who were trying to make a living there in Thyatira. Because if they wanted to get into this purple dye industry, they would have to join one of the trade guilds. And they couldn't just come in off the street and start working, dyeing things. But if they joined these trade guilds, they would have to participate in these pagan practices, which they did not want to do as Christians. And so it was difficult for them to find work. It was difficult for many of them to have a stable income. But it wasn't just their wallets that were in trouble. As we read this message from Jesus to the church. Jesus begins his message in verse 19 of Revelation chapter 2, and he says, "I know your works, love, sacrifice, service, faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, but she did not repent." Oh boy, there's some pretty big things happening here in Thyatira. Well, you notice that Jesus refers to Jezebel in his message to this church. And if you remember, Jezebel was a queen of Israel back in the Old Testament days who was not good to God's cause. She hunted down and killed his prophets, and she instituted the worship of a false god named Baal. And during the worship services, the worship practices for Baal, that they involved a lot of sexual and violent, immoral behavior. And if you want to read more about Jezebel and the things she did, you can read more of her story there in 1 Kings chapter 16 to 21. She was obviously bad news for the Israelites, and God is saying that there is some bad news here happening in the church of Thyatira. He continues in verse 22, "Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works." Yikes. These are some harsh words from Jesus. In fact, we probably are a little stunned to see such harsh words coming from Jesus. That kind of goes against how so many of us envision him. But we have to stop and think back to the things that Jezebel did, the devastation that she brought to the nation of Israel. In fact, we don't even need to look at that. If we look at world history, we'll find that a stubborn persistence of going against God, of going against his plan, always leads to death and destruction and devastation. And so God here is trying to nip that in the bud in this church, because he knows that the consequences of stubbornly refusing to follow him are always bad. And so he's saying, turn around, repent, come back to me, because you don't want to have to face those consequences of going down that other path. And so we find these harsh words because Jesus knows that if they continue on this path they're going to face harsh results, harsh consequences. And he continues in his message here in verses 24 and 25. Now to you I say, and to the rest of in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden, but hold fast what you have till I come. Jesus here is telling his people here in Thyatira to avoid knowing the depths of Satan. This is an interesting phrase that in some other translations are said as the deep things of Satan. And we're not quite exactly sure what the deep things of Satan refers to, but it's probably the belief that some people had it in certain Christian circles, that in order to experience God's grace and forgiveness, that people should sin and sin more. The more you sin, the more grace you get to experience. But this is something that Paul explicitly warns against in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 to 2. It would kind of be like someone announcing tomorrow that they found a miracle cure for cancer. Would that mean that you would go out and then try to do your best to contract cancer so that you could test out this cure? Of course not. You would want to still avoid cancer as best you could. And this is the same thing that Jesus wants for us as well, to avoid sin as best we can. And he concludes his message to the church in Thyatira in verses 26 to 28. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with an iron rod. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels, as I also have received from my Father. And I will give him the morning star. Jesus is ending here with this word of encouragement for these Christians that were struggling spiritually and struggling financially. He says, if you hold on to me until the end, until I return, then you will receive a throne. You will be able to rule the nations. You won't just be struggling to find work. You won't be struggling to make ends meet. Instead, you will sit with me on the throne as we rule the nations together. What a powerful word of encouragement. What a great promise Jesus ends with. And if we look at how this church is applied by historicists, when you look at that, use that historicism framework to apply Revelation to the Christian church era, we find that the church of Thyatira corresponds to the fourth period in the Christian era history, which lasts between the years 538 AD and 1565 AD. And during this period, there was a lot of upheaval. There was a lot of good things happening. The church was engaged in a lot of good works. At this time, the church was building hospitals and orphanages. They were starting schools and missions and taking the gospel around the world. But there was a lot of corruption that was starting to infest their belief system, much like what was happening to Israel under Jezebel's reign. And so God promised a time for them to repent. He would give them time for them to turn around and to come back to the right path. And yet the church refused to do so. And so the Christian church that had been solidly united up to that point fractured when Martin Luther, the German monk, ushered in the Protestant Reformation. And it wasn't just the theology, it wasn't just the church that was experiencing upheaval. During this time, the world was experiencing a lot of turmoil as well. During this era, there was a period known as the Great Famine. This was also the time when the bubonic plague came and decimated a lot of the population. This was the era where there was the 100 Years' War and other revolts and peasant rebellions. This time in history there was such upheaval that it ended up costing the lives of tens of millions of people. But thankfully, Jesus said that this was not the end. There was better days to come. And this is the story of the church at Thyatira. Does their story reflect your story at all? I know that as I look at the world, I see a lot of parallels. This is a strange time. There is a lot of upheaval within the church, across denominations. There is a conflict. In many cases, it comes back to the roots of tradition versus gospel truth. There is upheaval in the world around us. There is a global pandemic that we're facing. We're having to deal with racial injustice, a never-ending stream of climate disasters. There's political turmoil that's wreaking havoc. And yet, despite all of this, Jesus encourages us through this church of Thyatira to hold fast to him. I know that I never want to let go. I want to cling to Jesus. I want to hold on to the morning star until he returns. And I hope that you commit to holding on to him as well. God bless.